Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all here on day 4 of AERA. Welcome. It is such a pleasure to be able to introduce this amazing scholar and mentor of mine. The distinguished lecture this afternoon will be delivered by Dr. Carol Lee. Carol Lee is a professor emeritus, the former Edwina S. Terry Professor of Education in the School of Education and Social Policy and in African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is also the current president of the National Academy of Education, a role which she has taken on in what she calls her fake retirement, where she is leading a national effort to integrate civic reasoning into all content areas and across grade levels to take seriously what it would really take to support critical thinking and civic engagement. Professor Lee wears many hats. She is a scholar who's written numerous books and articles, including Cultural Literacy and Learning, Taking Bloom in the Midst of the Whirlwind. Her groundbreaking scholarship has changed how the field thinks about the cultural nature of thinking and learning, and has pushed us to consider the complexities of the learning and developmental processes and how they play out in literacy classrooms. In 2021 alone, Professor Lee received the McGraw Prize in Education, the James Squire Award from the National Council of Teachers of Education, and the Distinguished Contributions to Research Award of the American Educational Research Association. Each of these awards alone would be a major accomplishment, but to receive all of them in 1 year is really a testament to Professor Lee's mark on the field of education research. She is also a member of the National Academy of Education, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the American Education Research Association. She's a past AERA president as well. I first met Professor Lee in about 1997 at an AERA meeting where she boldly walked me and a group of doctoral students into a Spencer reception. None of us had invitations. That night, I watched her talk with all of the other great education researchers I had been reading about in my studies. And in the years since, she has been a model for me of how to be a thoughtful, engaged scholar and intellectual, how to read widely and build on others' ideas, even those who think differently from you, and how to support others and their ideas with kindness and grace. I couldn't be more excited for her talk this afternoon, which takes up one of the most critical issues we are facing in education today: how we support young people in being civically engaged, even in a moment where there are significant threats to our multicultural democracy. It is a timely and important topic, and I look forward to her brilliance and wisdom this afternoon.
So little did I know that she would end up being the president of the Spencer Foundation. Again, I really want to thank everyone for coming. I was sort of hoping somebody would show up, but I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to read my speech because I have a lot to say and it's a little long. So I'm maybe reading faster than you would like, in hopes that we will have some time at the end for Q&A. And I've set my phone to go off to try to pull me in, so we'll see. All right, so first I want to say that many of the ideas that I'm going to share today are influenced by and can be found in two important documents. One, the Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse report that's available online at the National Academy of Education website, and also the recent handbook that Naila, Roy P., Maxine McKinney DeRoyst, and I have put out called Handbook of Cultural Foundations of Learning. Like teaching, our roles as educational researchers entail not only knowledge building, but equally important to support efforts to bring what we learn scientifically to inform practice on the ground in ways that build robust opportunities for the holistic development of young people. While my comments today will focus largely on the K-12 sector, both formal and informal settings, our efforts, broadly speaking, certainly seek to address learning opportunities for persons across the life course. The theme of this AERA conference focuses on what is entailed in developing equitable systems of education. With this in mind, I want to address these challenges as systemic including their not only instructional practices on the ground, but also the broader policy structures and stakeholders who create conditions that can either support or constrain opportunity to learn. We are in a current historical moment where there are formidable challenges being posed around what should be taught in our schools. This is not a new challenge in our country. In 1927, George Coates cautioned in the yearbook of the National Association of Secondary School Principals that our systems of education must be cautious about who gets to make decisions about what is to be taught. Interestingly enough, he cautioned both about boards of education as well as interested parties who hold special interests. He included in examples of such parties the Daughters of the American Revolution, who have had a long history of advocacy around what should and could be taught in our schools, around the history of slavery and around race. At state levels, there have been many historical contestations around what is to be taught. Today, the battles include arguments that critical race theory is being taught in K-12 schools and that CRT should not be taught, that focusing on the history of structural barriers aimed at racialized non-white populations misrepresents the proper narrative of American history, that books on subjects around race, gender, and sexual identity and orientations must be banned, and that teachers addressing any of these areas in schools should be punished or fired. These fights over what should be taught are also happening at a time when the fields of education, broadly speaking, are arguing that schools need to address the holistic needs of young people, attending to social, emotional, and physical well-being. These calls are coming as we navigate over these past 2 years with a worldwide pandemic that has highlighted sources of inequities that existed before the pandemic, but have been heightened by virtue of the pandemic. This conundrum, parents in particular communities vehemently and sometimes violently arguing against teaching about what they consider controversial subjects. All stakeholders for the past 2 years who have experienced nonstop pressures because of the pandemic unfolds in the complexities of both our system of governance, particularly with regard to public education, and our contentious political fighting, certainly since 2016. In the US, unlike most other parts of the world, education is constitutionally the purview of the states. The federal government's source of influence is typically either the power of the purse, offering financial incentives for states to take up particular practices and policies, and or its legal ability to hold states, districts, and even individuals accountable where their actions are in violation of core principles of human rights as articulated in the US Constitution and its amendments. These violations are pursued through our court system, meaning they can be litigated in lower federal courts as well as the Supreme Court. Our system of government seeks to create pathways through which contestations over power and practice can be navigated, seeking to provide avenues for negotiating tensions among stakeholders, federal versus state authorities, different arms of the federal government, executive, legislative, judicial, majority and minority rights, the rights of the individual. The persistent challenge is with each generation testing the elasticity of this distributed system of governance. In our current contestations over what is to be taught, how to think about the role and agency of parents in light of the interests of the state, meaning both the individual state and the nation state, and how to think about the authority of teachers and principals in light of the goals of the state, including employment agreements teachers and administrators have. So, I hope in this talk today to delve into this maze of complexities, to offer some pathways for thinking about how to navigate these tensions. My recommendations today are informed by arguments made in the recent report by the National Academy of Education, Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse. In this report, we argued that preparing young people to engage productively with conundrums of the civic issues we face now and into the future is a special and unique role of public schooling. As Amy Gutman argues in her book, Democratic Education, public schooling in our democracy is the only venue that is available to the state to prepare young people to be productive participants in the civic domain. We consciously did not say preparation for citizenship because we have adults and children living in the United States who are not legal citizens and still are productive and important members of our society, who have the opportunity and indeed the ethical obligation to weigh in on circumstances and issues in the public domain. We can think about the powerful role that organized communities of undocumented persons, and in particular led by youth who are undocumented, have played in influencing public programs involving policies and legislation impacting potential pathways to citizenship. Also, and so a guiding proposition informing the argument I seek to make today is that how we can think about addressing these fights over what to teach, to whom, why, and how should be informed by this overarching goal: learning to engage in civic reasoning and discourse as the resource for civic engagement. A major challenge in these public fights over what to teach is that in many cases, they have not entailed extensive dialogic discourse. We see people shouting at one another at school board meetings and in legislative bodies, and the arguments being put forth have not been rooted in logic or evidence. And these challenges have been further complicated by the ubiquitous availability of misinformation on the internet, in the media, and various digital platforms that itself is not rooted in logic or evidence that in consequential venues would count, such as in courts, in medicine, in any site of activity where the consequences of decisions can mean life or death, that can seriously impact the lives of oneself and others. We can think of the many unfortunate examples of people who have gone on in the media spouting arguments against COVID vaccinations and proposing unsupported medical solutions, who have gone on to die because they refuse to follow what we have learned from the science of medicine. And of people who doubt information coming out of the CDC, for example, because it is changing, not recognizing that what we are wrestling with is a virus that is continuously mutating. So in order to navigate the complexities of the world, the complexities of the social contract of living together, we must, through public schooling, prepare young people to deal with complexity. If we think about some of the most common challenges within the civic domain that we are currently wrestling with, they entail multifaceted factors that unfold in dialogic relationships within and across multiple sites of activity and systems: the war in Ukraine, the COVID pandemic, the economic disparities, violence and gun control, health disparities, inequities associated with race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual identities and orientations, perceptions of ability, immigrant status, and immigration. There are certainly others, but these are the big ones and ones that we have faced in one form or another across time. What is happening in Ukraine today is reminiscent of the unfolding of fascism in Europe preceding World War II. If one examines our immigration policies across time, you will see how political beliefs about the nation state and other communities have shaped what have been often inequitable policies. Restrictive immigration of the Chinese in the 1800s, eugenics testing at Ellis Island restricting the Irish, Eastern Europeans, and Jews. We have much to learn from the 1918 influenza pandemic that can inform how we think about our current pandemic. In our democratic experiment, policies and practices impacting all of these big challenges can be influenced by public input through voting, through protests, through fights in the court, through efforts to shape the public discourse, through organizing stakeholders. That is the beauty of our system. What we fight over is the scope of the problem and the pathways felt by different stakeholders for addressing the problem. And what informs these pathways are different warrants, that is, values and belief systems that lead us to believe why any particular claim is supported by evidence and why that evidence is believed to be authoritative. We have argued in the civics report that civic reasoning entails the following dimensions: knowledge, conceptual and procedural related to the topics that are addressed in the civic problem; epistemology, valuing complexity, resisting simplistic solutions to complex problems; ethics, values that are informed not only by perceptions of one's own needs, but also the needs of others; empathy for others, a belief in fairness, a desire for the health, happiness, and well-being of others; and dispositions, to question, to weigh multiple points of view, to value evidence, to listen to others, and to empathize with others. We have argued that this scope of knowledge and dispositions are complex and subject to developmental evolution across the life course. And because of both their complexity and their developmental demands, socializing this range of knowledge and disposition should be the focus of education across the K-12 sector and across all subject matters taught. This is where the work we do as educational researchers comes into play. I will argue here that what we have and continue to learn from what I will call the sciences with an S of human learning and development offer useful resources for what conditions have to be in place to develop this range of knowledge and dispositions. And I will add that while I focus in this talk on preparing young people, it is equally important to think about how such knowledge and dispositions can be supported in adult populations of stakeholders around education: teachers and principals, parents, caregivers and family members, policymakers at different levels of the system. For me, the conditions I will describe to support such development need to be in place as adult stakeholders engage with one another in making decisions, not only about the big civic challenges I've identified, but most immediately for us right now, how the adult stakeholders need to be able to engage with one another so that the dimensions of the challenges around what is to be taught can be on the public table. Shouting at public school board meetings is not the climate for reasonable civic reasoning and discourse. We have evidence from political science and sociology of experiments involving pulling together people with very different political persuasions during the last two presidential election cycles, with supports for listening to one another, for weighing evidence, demonstrating that these contested groups can come to common ground. So I offer now a concise synthesis of these big ideas around human learning and development that have evolved across disciplines. I refer to this as the sciences with an S of human learning and development, in part because we still need efforts to better synthesize across these disciplines, and in so doing, to acknowledge and highlight where there are still contestations within fields. These contestations within fields include the following, to name a few: a focus on the individual versus interactions within and across groups; a focus on cognition versus the integration of thinking, feeling, and perceptions; conceptions of ability as fixed versus heterogeneous and malleable; looking at single sites of activity versus across sites of activity; attention to risk versus resilience; conceptions of group membership as homogeneous rather than both homogeneous and heterogeneous, meaning that all groups have ways in which they are similar as well as ways in which they are different, and certainly around conceptions of race. But I would argue that these ongoing tensions are typically situated within fields. What I am sharing are what I and many others now see as convergences across fields, convergences reached independently within each discipline. These disciplines include various fields of psychology, human development, learning sciences, cognitive, cultural, and social neurosciences. These convergent ideas include the following. One, that human development unfolds through dynamic relationships among individual genetics, biological processes inherited from our evolution as a species, and people's participation in cultural practices. That the human brain is malleable based on experiences across the life course. The complex system of human learning and development privileges relationships, positive attachments with others, and a sense of self-efficacy. Our meaning-making processes are filtered through perceptions of the self, perceptions of others, perceptions of tasks, and settings. And that human learning, and also the emotional salience we attribute to experience. Human learning and development unfold through people's participation in activity within and across spaces, within and across time, time in the moment, time in terms of where one is in the life course, and when in cultural historical activity, especially routine activities take place. The question then is how these big ideas inform how we think about preparing our young people to wrestle with the civic conundrums before us, and what such preparation means for our current contestations over what to teach around our contested history as a nation and our perennial dances with race and other forms of othering. I argue that these big ideas have implications not only for what and how we teach, but equally for how we need to think about conditions that can facilitate discourse among adult stakeholders around these questions of what to teach and how. First, our understanding of human malleability gives us hope that we can design environments and opportunities to expand how key stakeholders think about these civic challenges that I've described. That doesn't mean we will all come out thinking the same, but we can find common ground rooted in rationality and ethics, informed by democratic principles. The dispositions, the importance of attachments, of emotional salience attributed to experiences, direct us to think about designing experiences in which contested points of view are on the table, to think about how to build relationships and conditions in which people feel safe despite their differences. The centrality of perceptions means that designers, whether teachers in classrooms or policymakers at the school district or state levels, must seek to understand the multiple kinds of perceptions that participants bring and the relationships of those perceptions to the demands of navigating contested issues within the civic domain. Why is this coming? Telling me Java's doing something. Whatever. Okay, it's okay. Yeah. These include perceptions of the self, which must be grounded in understanding the multidimensionality of identity repertoires that individuals embody. Perceptions of the self as an individual, perceptions of the self as a member of what are likely an array of cultural communities, perceptions around race, ethnicity, immediate and extended family, gender, class, nationality, an array of communities of practice, and perceptions of the goals to be addressed in the designed activity spaces. Perceptions around identity are complex everywhere, but particularly in the United States, a nation which is fundamentally a nation of immigrants, those who came by choice and those who were forced, along with the indigenous communities, all of whom have their own complex relationships and histories with the nation state. The final big idea, namely that human development unfolds through participation in activity systems that range from micro-level interactions in specific activities to relationships across multiple sites of joint activity, home and family life, schools, sites of peer social networks, community settings, work, religious settings, settings in which people engage in things like hobbies. These systems that are impactful also include macro-level structures and belief systems. It is often these macro-level belief systems that inform entrenched positions that different stakeholders hold about what should and should not be taught. So for whatever may be the goal of organizing youth or adults, or youth and adults together to wrestle with contested ideas and points of view about what to teach, it is not sufficient to focus our attention on a single site of activity. As Chris Gutierrez refers to this as attending to people's movements across settings, it is highly likely that if not each, that most of these multiple settings matter for how people think. From a design perspective, this means we must seek to understand these multiple sites of routine activity that influence what learners bring to the task of examining our differences. As documented in the work of Diana Hess, you can imagine an adolescent who wrestles with points of view from his or her family that are in conflict with points of view shared in his or her peer social network or relationship with significant others. And the teacher needs to understand these multiple sources of influence. Shakespeare explored this dilemma in Romeo and Juliet, Lord, I'm tired. Romeo and Juliet, the story of young lovers from families who saw each family as the enemy, while Lorraine Hansberry wrestled with it in Raisin in the Sun, a story of an African-American family struggling from different points of view with how to be whole in the midst of the Jim Crow racism. Among the macro level beliefs that are deeply embedded in our contestations over how history is taught are conceptions of race and how these conceptions of race are taken up in our history and in books students might read in school. There are deeply entrenched beliefs that race is biological, that race is deterministic, and that race is singular. Virtually all of the categories used in the government's census assume as a default that each category is somehow homogeneous and singular. We know from biological studies of human diversity that race is not a biological construct. For example, among populations described as Black, there is greater genetic diversity than across groups ascribed to be white, and than what is often the other default, Asian or Asian descent. But the problem there is conflating constructions of race with ethnicity. And I might add the image here of the National Geographic, you probably have seen this, our pair of fraternal twins born from a Black and a white parent. And the whole issue becomes like, who's supposed to be Black or not Black? You look at them, how are you supposed to figure out what they're supposed to be? We know the history of defining classifications of race over the last several centuries and their absurdities. In addition, the very construct of race is relatively new in human history. Values associated with being of the majority race or minority race fuel tensions over predictions that by 2045, so-called whites will be a minority in the United States. But this is only a problem if one believes that so-called whites and Blacks and other quote unquote people of color are somehow fundamentally different and at odds with one another. These conceptions of race lead us to additional terminology that does not reflect reality. For example, we euphemistically use the term people of color. The term implicitly proposes that there are people of color and people without color, and that the people without color are the norm, the humans. In fact, all humans have color expressed through melanin in our skin, and that color ranges from ivory, which we can think of as the lightest spectrum of brown, cream color, to deep chocolate. Among the consequential conceptions of identity, however, is ethnicity. Ethnicity typically is powerful because it is intergenerational, with traditions of ethnic identity continued across time and across national borders, even as national borders shift. We have many practices in the United States where ethnic and pan-ethnic communities maintain traditions from their historical past. You can think of St. Patrick's Day, Kwanzaa, the Chinese New Year, among others. These historical identity commitments and relationships do come into play as people think about our history. African Americans' relationship with the African Holocaust of enslavement in the United States and legal apartheid or Jim Crow. Japanese Americans to their internment during World War II, the Second World War, historical discrimination against the Jewish community, European American Southerners' perceptions of their families' relationship to the Civil War, Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, perceptions of land displacement, broken treaties, genocidal acts in terms of stories about the founding of this country. I will argue that a disciplinary understanding of historical reasoning can be a useful tool for interrogating the complexities of our history as a nation. I would strongly suggest, if you haven't seen Ken Burns' documentary on Benjamin Franklin, you should see it. It's a powerful representation of the complexity of all the things we're talking about. We have all heard about Benjamin Franklin's admonition when asked about the future of our republic. The story goes, as Franklin was leaving Independence Hall in 1787, someone asked, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And he responded, "A republic, if you can keep it." There are some questions about this, but the warning is real. History provides us with this dilemma. Again, I'll keep reiterating that we must remember that Adolf Hitler was democratically elected president in 1934, and the conditions leading up to that election are cautions for us today. Germany was a democracy before the rise of the Nazi Party. So the question or dilemma before us is, what knowledge and dispositions do young people need to develop in order to navigate the possibilities and complexities of democratic governance? And what role does an understanding of our history, as well as the history of big historical moments around the world, play in such preparation? I think I've made the case for the knowledge and dispositions required to engage the complex civic and political issues of our time. But here I'd like to discuss on how knowledge of history, or what is called historical reasoning, can serve as a powerful resource. The debates in the public arena over what history and how history should be taught in our schools currently centers around critical race theory. However, historically, the question of how to teach about race in the United States has been an ongoing conundrum across the history of public education in the US. This attention to critical race theory is simply its most recent instantiation. Unless we think that arguments against critical race theory are somehow limited to particular segments of a white conservative community, I'll point your attention to the recent public debate between Gloria Ladson-Billings and John McWhorter, an African-American linguist. Ladson-Billings, along with William Tate, as you know, introduced the relevance of critical race theory to education in a powerful paper back in 1995. McWhorter, a Black scholar, argued against critical race theory. The arguments against critical race theory in K-12 schools are interesting from a logical perspective, in that they conflate a legal theory taught in law school with efforts in K-12 schooling to engage students in wrestling with historic and persistent discriminations against populations based on ascriptions of race. Putting that distinction aside, the foundational question in these debates is precisely, how do we explain discrimination practices in our history and currently, and how do we argue what constitutes discrimination and whether and how it matters? While I will focus my comments around race in US history, the foundational dilemma applies to other contested topics in the current civic domain. Addressing LGBTQ issues, immigration, health disparities, differential outcomes in education by race, ethnicity, and class, these all revolve around conceptions of the other and how the other should be perceived and treated in the context of the nation state. History is only partially about facts. Sometimes historians need to draw from across multiple documents to argue that particular events or decisions were made in the historical past. This is where attention to corroboration in the historical record matters. But perhaps more important and consequential, history is about argumentation over the meaning and significance of political events and decisions. People who argue that the Holocaust of the Second World War, in which 6 million Jews were killed, did not happen, are clearly living in a make-believe world. So when we look at these contestations over what should be taught, we can easily disregard those claims that are clearly irrational. The challenge there is how to make a rational appeal to the public and key stakeholders that irrational positions must be rejected. The bigger, more difficult, and more consequential question is how do we explain the meaning and significance of historical events? For example, the public fights over the 1619 Project are less about historical accuracy and more about the interpretation of events. The dilemma over what is the story that America tells about itself. How do we reconcile the high principles articulated both in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the US Constitution with the fact that so many of the men who wrote and signed the documents held other human beings in bondage? How do we reconcile the legal articulation of rights included in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments voted in after the Civil War to abolish slavery with the sustenance of laws, legal court decisions, and institutional practices that sustained discrimination, including the current decisions being made in states today that many argue are equally discriminatory, particularly around voting rights? These persistent conundrums in our wrestlings around our meta story as a nation are the embodiment of complexity. They typically do not involve contestation over facts, but rather over the meaning of facts. Such contestations over meaning are at the root of epistemological orientation and ethics. All the more reason why preparing our young people for civic reasoning and discourse must be centered in developing epistemologies of valuing complexity, of weighing multiple points of view, and in developing ethical reasoning, including thinking deeply about what democratic ideals mean. Excuse me. Our preamble states, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union, but a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. This means we and our young people must continuously wrestle over the questions, who is the we? What is justice? What is the common defense? Defense against what? And what are the blessings of liberty? The idea of a more perfect union implies that perfection is not an endpoint, but a process. It implies that at any given point in time, including from the beginning of the nation, we are not perfect. And consideration for securing the blessing for our posterity suggests that we must think about the future and not just the present moment. As the poet Khalil Gibran says in his poem On Children, you may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. Tomorrow means that our young people will face factors influencing issues in the civic domain that we cannot fully anticipate. It also means that as stakeholders wrestle with these questions over what to teach, as adults, we need to weigh how what we do can impact the next generation's abilities to push the boundaries that we cannot anticipate. For example, some have argued that legal decisions to expand opportunities for African Americans after World War II were in part a response to concerns of perceptions from other parts of the world about our system of legal apartheid, having fought fascism with segregated armies. The knowledge dimension of historical reasoning about events of the past, about the present, as I have argued, is complex. We have guidelines from the sciences of human learning and development to inform the scope of what people, specifically young people, need to know and be able to do in order to reason in rational and ethical ways about historical phenomena. I will seek to illustrate how these dimensions of knowledge building around civic reasoning and discourse can come into play in the current war against Ukraine. And I hope I can see what I've got. One, that there's a knowledge dimension, understanding the multi-ethnic communities and their history of relations with Russia, the recent political elections in Ukraine and the contested issues in those elections, the history of the devolution of the Soviet Union, relations between states in Eastern Europe that border Ukraine, the fact of NATO and what membership in Article 5 means, the human rights guidelines from the United Nations and complexities of decision-making in the UN Security Council, some brief history of nuclear weapon proliferation, who has these weapons, and immigration issues in Eastern Europe, particularly recent immigrants from Europe from Syria and the United States. This is just a knowledge dimension of thinking about this problem. Conceptual issues of understanding the international economic system. So we're putting in these sanctions, but how the systematic issues of how these things work have to be understood, and the economic and political relations in Russia itself. And then there are ethical issues very clearly in terms of the moral values that are entailed that we're wrestling with and in looking at this, and epistemological issues on how to examine relationships among the multiple contested interests, the interests of the different nation states, the interests of NATO, the interests of the Ukrainian state, et cetera. My point was simply to try to illustrate the complexities along these dimensions of civic reasoning in this current issue that is very real to us all. I have argued that identity processes are integral to human sense-making. I have argued that identity is not singular, but is multidimensional. In the US, as is the case in most other nations around the world, citizens and people residing in nations typically navigate both national as well as ethnic and pan-ethnic identities. In addition to affiliations from family history to religion and their participation in multiple communities of practice. These issues of relations between ethnic identity and national identity are particularly interesting. If we think about our wrestlings around race in the US, it is interesting to think about how ethnicity and perceptions of race intersect in our civic deliberation and contestations. If we take the case of peoples of African descent in the US, they are and have historically wrestled with what it means to be an American in light of the history of racism, de facto and de jure, what it means to sustain belief systems and cultural practices inherited from their African origins as sources of resilience in the face of not only trauma, but the conundrums of the human experience, and what it means to immerse oneself in an increasingly interdependent world. These relationships are not unique to African Americans. Ironically, there are few groups in the United States who have not wrestled with one form of discrimination or another. Poor whites, women, indigenous peoples, Latinx, and at particular points in our history, Jews, Asian descent communities, the Irish, European Americans, Muslims, LGBTQ communities. They have drawn on intergenerational communities of practice rooted in their special histories before the United States nation state as resources for resilience in light of both what they may have faced systemically, as well as the conundrums and frailties of being human. Efforts to understand these cross-cultural navigations can serve as a resource for an understanding of what we share as humans, following different pathways of development, but in the end aimed at our common need for health, safety, a sense of well-being, and meaningful relationships. I am drawn to two illustrations of this boundary crossing, viewing boundary crossing as the human endeavor. These examples are intended to illustrate how humans cross boundaries, where often there are societal mega beliefs that the communities being crossed are distinctly separate and in contention with one another. where one or the other is presumed superior in some ways to others. But it is precisely the ubiquitous evidence of such boundary crossing that is the hope of America, indeed the hope of the world. And perhaps our abilities to see such boundary crossing can help the purely self-interested groups imagine what they have in common. Marian Anderson, the great soprano singer, was an African-American woman born in 1897 in Philadelphia. Her talents were supported by her family, but also by the African-American church that she attended. She began to rise to fame, had toured around the world, but when she sought to perform at Constitution Hall, run by the Daughters of the American Revolution, she was denied because she was Black. Then, with the support from Eleanor Roosevelt in 1939, the decision was made to move the concert to the Lincoln Memorial and to perform on Easter Sunday. She opened before an audience on the National Mall of 75,000 people, an integrated audience singing the national anthem, "My Country, 'Tis of Thee." The moment is poignant and symbolic. She sings before the statue of Abraham Lincoln, known not only for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the enslaved Africans, but also who said his goal was to save the Union with or without slavery. And during a political election acknowledged that while he believed African Americans should have basic rights, they were not equal to whites. She sings the inspirational words of the anthem, reflecting the core principles of democracy as stated in the preamble to our Constitution, singing this song of hope and inspiration and love of country at a time of legal apartheid. She sings on Easter Sunday, which for her as a Christian is symbolic of rebirth. It's coming, folks.
The nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her capital debut at the great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall fanned a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax. The singer was invited by Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, who attends with Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau. Spectators include Supreme Court Justice Black, New York Senator Robert Wagner, and a host of notables, here to listen to the voice acclaimed by many as the finest in a century.
And I tear up every time I listen to it of the irony. It's the contestations and the navigating the good, the opportunity of this moment and the irony of this moment simultaneously. This moment in history is emblematic of the contestations, of the complexities, of the conundrums and opportunities of investigating our history when that history is not constrained by simple explanations. To study our history in ways that acknowledge the always competing sets of interests, that acknowledge both the good and bad of human actors, including acknowledging the inherent contradictions that individuals, often consequential historical actors, embody, including our current politicians and political stakeholders. Lincoln and Jefferson were both good and bad. During the Holocaust of enslavement, whites were both slaveholders as well as abolitionists. Poor whites and poor blacks suffered during Jim Crow, while ironically, it was members of poor white communities who engaged in the horrors of lynching. These are insights we learned from the science of human learning and development. Humans have the capacity for great kindness for others and for great evil against others. Both capacities have evolved from our evolution as a species, but it is our participation in routine cultural practices, including those young people experienced through their participation in 12 years of public education, that matter for whether our worst capacities or our best capacities thrive. The fiercely public battles in which we are now engaged and have historically been engaged around what to teach in our schools, particularly around our history and issues having to do with race and additional forms of othering, are often fueled by assumptions that we live in silos. But the sciences of human learning and development would suggest otherwise. We are shaped by our participation in routine cultural practices. From the perspective of ecological systems theorizing, these routine cultural practices are many and relationships across them matter. Sometimes we experience similar messaging around values and knowledge across these settings of practice. Sometimes we experience knowledge and values that are either in tension or that are on the surface bear little relations to one another. Under these circumstances, a central task of sense-making is reconciling these tensions, having supports for reconciling such internal tensions and possible contradictions matter. Public schooling can play an important role in this. I'm not going to play the totality of this, but just a pinch of it, in the sense of what is available in the public medium for young people to normalize what we think about as difference. And this is from Sesame Street.
The wheels on my chair go round and round, round and round, round and round. The wheels on my chair go round and round, all through the town.
So you get the essence of it, and he ends up kidding around with some other kids and they're sort of playing basketball. This issue of creating normative opportunities to understand the diverse expressions of humanity, and that what is available to our children currently, even in the media, despite the fact that when they go home, their parents may be telling them something different. Okay, go quickly. I'll turn now to questions of epistemic complexity. I offer the Ahmaud Arbery case as an illustration of both the legacy of racism in our society, as well as the democratic possibilities of our system of governance, and the hope demonstrated by our people that justice and democracy can work. The young African-American man, Ahmaud Arbery, is jogging in an all-white neighborhood when three white men chase in a truck and car with weapons in hand, and with no evidence presume him to have stolen from a house under construction. A house under construction. They reach him and execute him. The legacies of racism are reflected in the fact that the three men convicted of Mr. Arbery's murder believed they had the right to believe that a Black man jogging through their all-white neighborhood was dangerous, and assumed that he'd been engaged in theft in a building under construction, that they had the right to follow him with guns in hand and to kill him. These actions reflect the same logic and lack of morality that drove the lynching of Black men and women during the Jim Crow era. The fact that the law department initially did not seek to even investigate the case reflects the systemic structures that have sustained discrimination, in this instance, de facto. But on the other hand, the possibilities of citizens, including the undocumented and those without legal status, to organize protests against discriminatory acts is a testimony of the power of our system of governance, a cause for hope. The case was brought before the court because of community organizing, and the allegations against the former Brunswick district attorney are now under legal investigation for her efforts to keep the murder from being brought to trial. A jury that was all white except for one Black member examined the evidence and voted unanimously to convict all three men. This stands in stark contrast to the historic case of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old Black teenager killed in Mississippi in 1955, ironically a year after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, where the men who carried out the horrendous murder were never convicted. The outcome of the Arbery case gives us hope. Parents and others who argue that addressing the challenges of studying racism in the broadest sense will lead their children to feeling guilty can be engaged in extended conversations with multiple stakeholders to raise important questions. When we see in our history evidence of harm to communities of people, I would think we would want exactly that, to feel bad. Our moral compass should lead us to feel bad when we see the horrors of the African enslavement, when we see Native American children taken from their families and forced into boarding schools where the explicit goal was to beat out of them any memory and connection with family and their cultural traditions, when we see images of public lynchings, when we see images of protesters in Charlottesville with signs and shouting, "Jews will not replace us," when we see children on our southern border literally in cages, and when we see the devastation against innocent civilians, especially children today, every day on the news in Ukraine, yes, we should feel bad. If we move as a society where these images do not impact us, do not lead us to empathy and to consider what actions in the public and private domain we can engage to change these evil acts, then our democracy is clearly in jeopardy. And let us again not forget 1934. It might be helpful for those who argue against inclusion in our curriculum to think of studying history that examines the unfortunate illustrations of discriminatory practices against multiple cultural, ethnic, and religious communities. Discrimination against Jews, the Irish, the Italians, and others at particular points in our history. The persistent intergenerational poverty in Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta. The internment of the Japanese during World War II, but not the Germans or Italians. The segregation laws around public schooling against the Chinese, the Japanese, Mexican, and other Latinx communities. As the poet Maya Angelou warned, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So I'm going to try to close because I'm about out of time, but I do want you to hear this, well, two quick little things. One is this letter some of you may have seen that this 6-year-old boy sent to President Obama when he was viewing on the news the horrors in Syria. And if you look at it, just the language of the child, but the essential goodness and ethics of the child. Then bring him to my house. And then this final example that I love of closing around the notion of laminated border crossing that is just part of our country and way of life, but we don't view it and see it. So I'm closing with this video of Aretha Franklin singing Puccini's Nessun Dorma. First, because I love it, but for the hope I want to convey in this lecture that, like young Alex, it reflects a country, a world in which crossing cultural boundaries, presumed to be separate worlds, are actually laminated sites of opportunity. At the 1998 Grammy, Pavarotti was expected to sing his legendary version of Nessun Dorma, but because of illness at the last minute, he could not appear. Aretha, the Queen of Soul, steps in and performs the Italian aria, but infuses it with her African foundations of nuance, and in so doing embodies the multi-tiered hybrid that I would argue is the foundation of creativity. And this is the end. Oh, but listen to Aretha first.
Never too afraid to stand guardi le stelle che tremano d'amore e di speranza. Within my heart, my secret lies, and what his name is, none shall know, none till on thy eyes I confess it. Soon as morning light shall dawn. Oh, prince, then shall my kisses break the silence that made me mine.
So I apologize for having gone so long, but I had a lot to say, so I just pushed it in. But I hope that this becomes, a real life illustration, embodiment, that those who want to argue that we live in silos, that we really don't live in these silos. And maybe if we understand that, we can figure out a way to come to common ground. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You see, I'm tearing up. Alex makes me tear up. Marian makes me tear up, and so does Aretha.